Thank you for that gracious and welcoming greeting and for your hospitality here at St. Kate's. We're very delighted to be gathered here at an institution that's very founding reflected a deep commitment to justice and opportunity for all. My name is Ron Anderson, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of Century College and also as the chair of the Minnesota Campus Compact. Each spring, we gather together for this Minnesota Campus Compact Summit and Award Luncheon, in part to celebrate the civic learning and leadership that's taking place all across our state. As we'll experience throughout the day, we have numerous individual, communal, and institutional strengths to build upon. While our specific priorities may vary, we all share this fundamental commitment to strengthening our communities and our democracy. We recognize our responsibility and our capacity to work for good, and we value the continuous learning, analysis, and reflection that we each engage in on a daily basis. Of course, the work we're doing isn't easy, nor is the context in which we do it simple. As you know, Minnesota ranks high nationally in civic engagement, but we also have some of the highest racial disparities in education, incarceration, employment, and health. This means to me that we're not fully realizing our civic engagement goals or the missions of our colleges, universities, and community partners. So our second purpose in convening together today is to wrestle with difficult questions and to identify promising models and practices that can inform our individual and cumulative or collective engagement efforts. Our hope is that each of us today will be inspired, we will spark some new connections and strengthen our collective resolve to make this a state where everyone has the opportunity to fulfill their full potential. A state where every student graduates with the determination and skills to contribute to the public good. A state where every college and university is deeply engaged with its communities, working together to educate our students and our citizens to solve problems and to build a stronger democracy. I want to thank you all for being here today, and more importantly, thank you for believing in the public purposes of higher education. Special thanks to those who are sponsoring our event today. Their logos are seen up on the screen, for helping make this gathering possible. We're fortunate to begin our time together this morning with a keynote panel of civic leaders, each a visionary and powerful individual in their own distinctive ways. Here to introduce our panel and moderate the discussion is Shonda Smith Baker, the President and CEO of Pillsbury United Community.
I've got my iPad and my notebook. I can't quite make up my mind if I still like to write or if I want to read from my electronic thing here. But I'm so glad to be here this afternoon and be able to participate and represent, I think, leadership and the direction that we're going in as a community together to address, I think, a very important question in terms of what's required now to fully engage everyone, to build the community that we all desire, and to really tackle the difficult questions that Ron mentioned to get us there. So this morning, I hope to have very much a conversation with these great panelists. There'll be time for questions and answers, so if you have them, think through them, and then you'll just raise your hand and someone will come around with the mic. As Ron mentioned, I'm the president and CEO at Pillsbury United Communities. I've served on the Compact board for a term, and it's been a great pleasure learning this side of the world in a different way, so thank you for that. We have three panelists, Chairwoman Diver, Nikema Levy-Pounds, and Andrew, who I did not practice your last name enough. So let's, okay, he can do that. I apologize for that. But I can tell you all three of these great panelists have things that have stuck out to me, or things that I wish that I had done. And so Karen's got her master's from Harvard, and Andrew's got his PhD, and Nikema's an attorney, all of the things that in my last life or my future life I hope to achieve. So I'm going to introduce them briefly. Their bios are in your brochure here, and then they'll just jump right in and provide a little bit more of an explanation. So first I'd like Chairperson Diver to come up. She's in her third term as Chairwoman of Fond du Lac Band of Superior, Chippewa. Nakima Levy-Pounds, who's at St. Thomas and very much involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. She also is now a personal friend of my daughter who went to one of her presentations, and she's been talking to me about social justice in a much more fired up way since. And then we have Andrew, who is the president of the National Campus Compact. I'm going to jump right in and just have each of our guests just provide a little bit more of an overview. I think the bio that you can read will give you some of the nuts and bolts, but I think that we know that the work goes much deeper, and I wanted them to give an opportunity just to highlight their journey and maybe an accomplishment or something that they would like to share with you. You look ready. Share with me.
All right. I shouldn't have had that second cup of coffee. I look ready. I'm Kara Diver, chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa. It's a tribal nation located near Cloquet, Minnesota. Actually 100,000 acres due west of Duluth down to about Carleton, Minnesota. I manage a workforce of 2,200 people. That makes us the second largest employer in northeastern Minnesota. So we're a large operation, about half corporate and half government and services. But before that, I spent quite a great deal of time in the nonprofit sector, community development, and a whole bunch of advocacy. And I guess if I had to pick one thing that I am most proud of is I started a little grassroots organizing project around the importance of early childhood education, and I had a little $1,500 grant, and from that it grew into a $50 million investment in the state of Minnesota by philanthropy and government called Ready for K. So I'm most proud of that.
Good morning. So I am president of the National Campus Compact. I've been in that role a little bit less than a year. And I started engagement work kind of because I was living a double life. So I was, on the one hand, an academic and kind of followed a traditional path. I did my PhD here at the University of Minnesota. And so I love coming back here because I have many happy memories, even though I did graduate work in the state of Minnesota. But I always had kind of that path, academic path, and I headed into the role, etc., along with a kind of another life as an engaged political, civic person. And from there, it always seemed to me that those things should have some relationship to each other. I studied political theory because I actually cared about political ideas in the political world we live in. But I didn't find natural ways to connect them. And eventually decided I had to do that. And so kind of without realizing, I think that there was a larger context for this work and a movement of people who had built a lot of knowledge about how to engage effectively through the academy and teaching and research. I just kind of began doing things, engaging my own students, both in political work and in community-based research. And one of the things I discovered in doing that was that my students cared much more about the classes they were taking with me when that work was connected to the real world, when they were working in solidarity with others, in partnership with others to achieve shared goals. And so that kind of is what drew me in, and I eventually moved into administrative roles, first at Princeton and then at Rutgers-Camden, supporting and facilitating this work. And at Rutgers-Camden had the opportunity to work in a community, Camden, New Jersey, which is typically rated as among the poorest and most violent communities in the United States. And I was working with a chancellor who was kind of a visionary leader in this work and who wanted us to frame a way that the university could be part of solving problems that the community cared about, not by serving them, but by working, making common cause, working together to realize a community that was consistent with values we all shared. So that was the work that led me to my role at Campus Compact, and I'm very excited to, I've learned a lot about, in just the last couple of days, about work that's going on in Minnesota. This is a state that's inspiring because of the depth of commitment and the real thriving civic culture, and so I'm very happy to be here today to talk with you about this work.
Thank you. Nakima?
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today. So I'm Nakima Levy-Pounds. I'm a law professor at the University of St. Thomas. a civil rights attorney, and I'm also the director of the Community Justice Project, which is a civil rights legal clinic. I moved to Minnesota in 2003 to begin teaching at St. Thomas when the law school was about 2 years old. And I will never forget a conversation that I had with a faculty member at a different law school who was telling me about Minnesota. And that particular faculty member talked about, you know, how wonderful Minnesota is as a place to live. It would be a great place to raise my family. And our distressed communities aren't so distressed. And so that was my belief system for my first couple of years. But then I actually put aside some of the mainstream newspapers that I had been reading, and I started reading the community papers. And I saw a completely different side of the story in terms of the disparities that communities of color were facing, some of the concerns that were being raised across, you know, education, criminal justice. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so I was not comfortable knowing those statistics and hearing those narratives and continuing to stay in the role that I was in. So when I got to St. Thomas, I had started the family law clinic where we were focused on, you know, representing people in family law cases. But after learning about these issues, I felt that I needed to go in a different direction. And so I worked with a former law student to start the Community Justice Project. And there wasn't really a template for our work in the Community Justice Project. It was really driven by a desire to see how we could utilize the resources that we have within the law school. I see students as our greatest asset, actually. But how can we use the resources and the training that we have received in law to begin to work on bridge building with the community and to serve as advocates alongside of them in the fight for justice. And so that's what I've been doing ever since. And that's opened doors to not only speak about these issues and be at the table with government stakeholders, pushing, pulling, prodding, and advocating for change, but also writing about these issues. So I blog for the Star Tribune and also write for a number of other publications in the Twin Cities about the need to close the gaps that we know are plaguing our state. And there are going to be impacts for all of us if we don't begin to take these matters seriously. So I hope that today we can dive into some of these issues and that you all will be open to asking the tough questions, the uncomfortable questions, so that we can really go somewhere in this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the title of today's conference, Rethinking Excellence in a Diverse Democracy, really, I think, summarizes what I hear from the panelists and certainly what I hear in my work, is that excellence may mean one thing for some and another thing for others. And so, you know, if we are going to be more diverse, then we certainly, and excellent at that as a community, we certainly can't leave people behind. And that if diversity and embracing it and having excellence is necessary, then I think we need to make sure that we have the environments that promote that.
I also found this frame an incredibly useful way to start talking about where we need to go and the ways we in higher education certainly need to think about changing our institutions and our practices. And for me, you know, one of the things I've been reflecting about a lot recently is that higher education has a whole series of interrelated prestige problems. That's how I think about them. So we have institutions that have prestige. And we usually mean by that institutions that serve people who have already been very well served throughout their lives and give them the opportunity to kind of double down on the advantages they already have. That's what counts as high prestige in academia. We have roles that we afford more prestige to than others. So within our institutions, faculty roles versus staff roles, for example. So people doing extremely important work on our campuses that enable everything to happen, who are often, in this room, many of you know, responsible for building the very important relationships that sustain our engagements with communities. Often their value is diminished because they're not faculty members. And work in the way we think about research and teaching, we often devalue work that is most connected to the real lives of human beings, right? So solving abstract problems is seen as more valuable, more prestigious than actually addressing the challenges of our communities and dealing with the realities of people's lives. And so for me, all of that is kind of flipped upside down and out of order, and it means we have a deep problem aligning the work we do with the actual challenges that we face as communities, as societies, and even within our institutions in the way that we address just the people that we're connecting with on a daily basis. So from my perspective, when we think about excellence, we need to be asking fundamentally a question about why institutions of higher education exist in the first place. And from my perspective, that has to do with preparing the citizens we need to have a sustainable democracy, as well as preparing people to do the work to create the possibility for shared prosperity, which we know is not automatic, but at least you actually need an economy to have that be possible. And if we focus on that mission and then think about excellence in relation to that, who is doing the work of preparing our citizens? Who is creating the conditions for the possibility of shared prosperity by helping raise up communities that have historically been underserved or excluded, et cetera? We start to think very differently about excellence. And so for me, it's about kind of refocusing on why these institutions exist, why our public institutions deserve public subsidies, why our nonprofit private institutions deserve the tax exemption that constitutes a public subsidy. Why are we asking people to invest in us if we are not thinking about excellence in terms of these broader questions of creating the kinds of communities, the kinds of democracies, the kind of global society that we want? So for me, those are kind of the questions that are raised by that frame.
Very helpful. So the chairwoman and I are both community bound and not in higher ed. And so, you know, I think from your experience and watching the young people from your community and broader, what do you think higher education needs to be looking at in terms of how they embrace diversity and ensure that there's access for everyone in our institutions?
Usually when I'm in a group like this, obviously being able to go to an Ivy League school is something that is of interest to other folks. The fact of the matter is I really didn't want to go to Harvard because it was Harvard, although that's kind of cute. I wanted to go to Harvard because they had a program that was called the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. And it was the one research center that had some longevity in Indian country of studying what best practices look for tribes in terms of community self-governance and sustainability. And if that program would have been somewhere else, I would have applied there first. So my interest in that school was because it allowed me to grow in service to my own community, and it just happened to be there. So, I mean, it was kind of a win-win, I'll admit. But it was almost unattainable because of the expense. I was a teen mother, born to one parent who was a boarding school kid, certainly not in a position to think that educational institutions were there to look out for his welfare and self-sufficiency. In fact, they were there to demean him and tell him exactly what his place was in the world, which was, at best, as a servant or blue-collar worker to somebody else, and a mother who didn't graduate. Young parents themselves, then I was a young parent. So I moved to Minnesota when I was 18 years old, dragging a 3-year-old to go to University of Minnesota Duluth. Like you said, there was no systems that were really designed to help me overcome any of those barriers. Welfare officials wouldn't approve my plan for school, so I couldn't get help from them. I lived on $324 and couldn't get any food stamp help or anything else other than what I was eligible for with Pell. I met a lot of people who told me why I couldn't do it, but I met not one person who told me that they believed I could. I am here because I am spiteful. And it seemed so incredibly unfair that all of the systems kind of aligned. What did I meet when I went to UMD? I found the Indian Studies department and the community there that they created for their students, and I found my kin away from home, a place where I felt welcome. But the minute I left that room, I ran into instructors who didn't understand that I had no backup childcare and I needed to retake a test. You either take the test or you fail. Guess what? I failed. I had terrible grades at UMD. Terrible grades. It took me longer because of it, but guess what? I ended up being the first woman to graduate from the Levy-Pounds School of Business, American Indian woman. It wasn't an indicator of how smart I was, it was an indicator of how hard it was. I took 18 to 24 credits a quarter because I was poor. And I didn't want my daughter to ever remember being poor. Moral of that story, why did I go to school and what did I need to get there? I needed every once in a while somebody to meet me where I was at instead of having the expectation that I meet you where you're at and where the institution's at. I needed a little adaptability. I also needed a little bit of somebody, some help with it, just someone to be a navigator. You know, what's out there, Karen? Because my problems weren't necessarily within the four walls of the institution. They were in everything I had to deal with in order to stay there and be there. And too often we don't feel like we have to be adaptable, and here we are, and sure, you'll throw the door open, but if I can't get to the door, you know, all is for naught. But the bottom line is, what did I want for myself? I wanted to be personally self-determined and self-sufficient. I wanted to be able to love what I did every day. But I needed to be able to do that without a guilty conscience. I needed to look at my child and know she had a better opportunity and she had good nutrition and she had a chance to take things like ballet, because that's what other kids got to do. And I wanted her opportunities to seem much broader and with much less barriers than my own. So, you know, it's kind of a long-winded way of saying, you know, we're here in service to the people who pay us. It's called customer service. And too often our bureaucracies are geared towards the lowest common denominator. How do we homogenize things so it's easy for us? And people are just a little too complicated for that. And until we understand that our service is to the individual as well as the communities, then we're going to fail to adapt and meet their needs and keep them through till the end. So a little personal story to illustrate that our institutions have become too bureaucratic. And that's the easy way. And if you want to meet the needs of diverse learners, then you have to deliver the service in diverse ways.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Nakima, I think you're kind of a blended world between, I think, the two responses, and certainly everyone has their passion around engagement. As a professor and coming here and then recognizing the two stories and then putting in place the work that you did at St. Thomas, what did you learn from that? Like, what needs to change in terms of priorities in higher ed? You know, both from someone coming into this environment straight there and then recognizing something differently, and then perhaps seeing the assets within St. Thomas differently.
Okay, so I have a few thoughts that I want to share. I think, number one, we have to begin to rethink the way that we do business. It's time for a paradigm shift in higher education. Unfortunately, sometimes we're operating off of antiquated models that worked when there was less diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, and that worked when there were fewer people from a lower socioeconomic status who attended institutions of higher education. I think the demographics have shifted dramatically here in the state of Minnesota, and particularly in the Twin Cities. But I don't think that the way that we deliver our services has caught up with the demographic shift, which means that we're going to be unprepared and underprepared for the way that Minnesota will look in the future. These are conversations that I've had with people in the business community. Same thing. The business community is used to being in an environment where we have, you know, the most literate folks in the country, folks who have high degrees of academic attainment and who are from a middle and upper middle class white culture. However, as we can see, anytime you're in the Twin Cities, you can see that that is not the case. And yet the business community is still expecting folks who fit that criteria to actually show up and apply for jobs. Well, that's not going to be the future workforce. And so if the business community does not reconsider how it's looking at the criteria for who should be employed there, if they're not looking at building pipeline programs to make sure that they have workers who are eligible for positions, and if they're not looking at the impacts of the public education system on who is actually going to be qualified and equipped to take on those jobs, they're going to have major problems. I use the business community as an example because there are parallels to what's happening in higher education. If we don't have pools of students that we can choose from our public education system, who want to attend our institutions, who are prepared to attend our institutions, and who are being positioned to take on some of those careers, then we're not going to have clients that we can serve in the community and into the future, which again, I think is problematic. And so we need to rethink the way that we do business. We need to think about what our institutions need to look like in terms of the student body. Are we excluding folks because of how they performed on a standardized test, which may not be, and is usually not, especially for people of color and low-income folks, an indication of their level of intellect and their ability to be successful. I know that there are outside influences that play a role in terms of how we view results on standardized tests, but on some level we need to begin to push back against those external systems that are making it difficult for institutions of higher education to fulfill their actual missions and to begin to dig more deeply and think about the communities that are surrounding our campuses and the fact that there's a lot of talent in those communities. There are a lot of folks who would be contributing members of society, but they get overlooked because of how they may have done our test, or the fact that maybe they don't have a blueprint in terms of understanding what is expected when they enter an institution of higher education. So it's easy for me to relate to your story because I grew up in the inner city of Los Angeles. I was the first in my family to go to a four-year institution to graduate to become a lawyer, and I really didn't have a blueprint for what that should look like. What it took for me was having folks around me. So my teachers when I was in junior high school who surrounded me and who kind of showed me the ropes. So they basically lent me some of their social capital, cultural capital, and intellectual capital to help me understand how to navigate life, how to navigate society, and what would be expected so that I could thrive. And my own experience makes me wonder how many other young people are out there who are not being given access to these opportunities. We can't afford to keep people on the margins and to limit access to higher education. That's the passport to upward mobility. And so if we're thinking about this in terms of service delivery, how are we looking at this issue of diversity? Are we just setting aside a small number of slots for poor students of color, or because we want to look diverse, as opposed to really thinking about this in terms of investing in our future workforce and the people who, if given the opportunity, can actually make a difference in our society. I also think excellence entails having graduates of our institutions of higher education leave with a stronger sense of responsibility for what's in the best interest of the common good. Too often, the narrative when people walk through the doors of higher ed or when they walk through the doors of a law school is that it's really about you. It's about you working hard. It's about you doing well. It's about you getting the best job that you can get so that you can buy the nicest house and, be able to support your family. Now, obviously, we know that that's important. However, there should be another part to that narrative that says, what are you going to do with this degree that's going to impact the common good in a positive way? What's your sense of responsibility when you see people on the margins, when you see people struggling, when you see people who are locked out of access to opportunity? How can you be a catalyst for change when you see those things happening? Too often, I think we fail to articulate that narrative. If we begin to articulate the narrative, my hope would be that that would trickle into how we do business, whether or not we are looking at our systems through a lens of equity. And I would argue that if the way we deliver services hasn't changed in light of the shifting demographics, then we're probably operating off of an antiquated model.
Thank you, Nakima. I think the follow-up to that is around the opportunity in education, and that we often are talking about. Nakima and I talked briefly about the achievement gap and whether or not it's even should be called that, and I think we agree there. But as we look at the opportunity gap, and we know that we need to expand the opportunity both for who gets into universities and colleges and also who attains college degrees. Andrew, you mentioned just the pressure of prestige, which means some get in and some don't, and it's based on whatever that criteria is. So I do find it interesting, universities that are expressing they do want to address achievement gaps, but yet still have this barrier for everyone to get into schools, which then impacts whether or not, how they're defined. And so it's clearly a problem to be solved in a university setting. And so, if we are to move the needle on these gaps, what do we need to think about, or what might universities have to give up, or what will they gain? I mean, how do we reconcile those two realities?
So for me, there are, I guess, at least two different pieces of this. One is, I think a lot of the points we focus on are points that are too late in the process. So we actually had a conversation last night among ourselves about faculty diversity. And obviously it's very important for institutions to focus on having diverse faculties. It's also the case that by the time you get to that point in the development of individuals, so many people have been excluded from opportunity along the way that you don't have the pools of candidates that you otherwise would. So for me, both the point of admission to college is pretty late in the game, the point of hiring people is pretty late in the game. Those are very important. But for me, if colleges and universities are going to fulfill their mission to educate people from all backgrounds, and particularly communities that have not had historical access to higher education, we need to be focused much, much earlier on partnerships that advance pre-K learning, K-12 learning, on building pathways that are successful. And that means not just sending out some students to do some tutoring every once in a while, although it's good for students to tutor. It means really engaging as partners in ongoing, sustained work with clear goals that have to do with transforming the institutions that are entering into these partnerships. And that's, of course, part of it is that you cannot enter into partnerships if you assume that you yourself will remain entirely fixed, and then you will work with partners who can meet your model, right? You need to actually ask questions about what does our calendar look like in relation to the calendars of the people that we're working with? What do our kind of criteria for structuring our courses look like in relation to the entities, the institutions, the individuals we're partnering with? So there has to be a willingness to change and to engage in transformation that creates pathways for people. I think there is also, a part of this is the ways that our institutions are judged. And so, for example, we have ranking systems, we're all familiar with these, whether it's US News or whatever, that literally privilege rejecting the most people, right? So then we see these crazy outcomes where students apply to more and more institutions, and then the acceptance rates get lower and lower at the most prestigious institutions, and they claim that as a victory. Like, our acceptance rate is down to 7% because now students apply to 20 places, so we're getting a larger applicant pool. This literally serves no one. It detracts from all sorts of people. So a willingness, for me, especially for institutional leaders, to speak out in a clear voice and with some consequences for the rankers about an unwillingness to participate in systems like that. And I think that's a longer term process. It's a kind of movement type process to actually push back against these things, but recognizing their consequences in the real lives of people hopefully we can get ourselves motivated to do the work at the level of our own institutions, but also at the level of a higher education community to try to restructure some of the values by which we are evaluated and the ways we celebrate ourselves.
So you're all real smart folks. In your fields, you want to meet the needs of diverse learners, but at some point you need to turn that laser sharp attention on yourselves and within your institutions. With pay inequities continuing to grow and getting larger and larger every day, your business model of how you deliver your services is enormously outdated. Chances are students of color will not have the income that is necessary to sustain the debt they're going to need to take on to participate. The income gap is growing and growing, and unfortunately the key of a college education is no longer the one thing that changes all of that. And a lot of us end up being really incented to get into careers that are service related. Once again, those are at the lower sphere of what's going on. You build bigger buildings for years. You have tons of debt service, and you have a model that says your programs within your institutions need to float their own boat. Well, guess what? I don't have a circle of wealth that follows me into your institution and follows me once I become an alumni. My relatives look like me before I went to college. They are me now. I take care of a lot of them. I have a huge extended family that I'm responsible for. Am I going to give an alumni gift? No, I'm going to take care of my family first. That doesn't mean that I am automatically a part of the social circles where wealth is concentrated either. So guess what? The things that would be important to me for you to invest in, you're not going to because they're not profitable or self-sustaining in the same way that a lot of other things are. So until we look at how you finance yourself and how you put your resources that you are able to gain through your networks to work in changing that dynamic, then you have an unsustainable model. And it's just a fact. I mean, we can talk about having diverse workforces within your institutions. We can talk about how you make connections, but until people can pay for it and not be impoverished for their choice, then you're not really going to change any of the outcomes. So I guess I felt like I really needed to put that on the table of, yeah, the business model of how we finance education is, to me, the biggest barrier to making yourselves relevant to diverse communities. They can't afford to stay poor for the privilege of having an education.
You have anything to add, Nikki?
I would just, it goes back to what I was saying about rethinking the way that we do business. But another piece of that has to do with recognizing the role that politics play, which I'm sure some of you do, in the decisions that are made. So I'll give one quick example. When we're looking at the educational opportunity gap in education for K through 12, there are conversations surrounding how to increase access for students of color to attend institutions of higher ed while they're still in high school. So there are post-secondary enrollment options that are available. Students of color don't get to take advantage of those opportunities as readily as their middle-class white peers, primarily because they don't have access to the information. And the reason that they don't have access to the information is because of tension between those who control budgets, for example, at some of the K through 12 institutions, and feeling as though there is competition when the money follows the students. So if students go outside of their high school and they go to, let's say, MCTC, that money is going to follow the student while they're still in high school. And so K through 12 feels that resources are being taken away from them. What they don't realize is that when students have access to post-secondary enrollment options, it actually gives them a sense that they could be successful in college. And in fact, they tend to do better in college, as well as being more likely to graduate and go out and actually get a career. And so I think that that's one of the things that higher ed could play a huge role in beginning to shift, in terms of these dynamics, and being more vocal about ensuring that young people get access to those post-secondary enrollment options. Because if they go to a 2-year college first, then they may be more likely to come to a 4-year institution and actually complete their degree, which is going to increase their lifetime earnings. It's actually going to serve as a positive example for other young people and their families and in their communities. It might start a chain reaction, which is what we need to see happening here if we're going to shift the paradigm. The other thing that is problematic about the way in which services are currently being delivered in higher education has to do with this huge push to push students towards remedial education because of, maybe how they scored on the AccuPace or some other test. And that is very expensive, number one, to have students spend a year or more in remedial courses. And it also sends young people the message that they're not capable of achieving at the college level if they're spending a year having to learn things that they really should have learned in high school. So I would love to see higher ed become more involved in those conversations to say, how can we address this issue of remedial education and make sure that we're leveling the playing field? Because all the problems that we're talking about up here, none of us created because of the fact that historical inequities, systemic racism and discrimination has played a role in terms of this landscape that we're dealing with, in terms of the vast inequities that exist in terms of socioeconomic status and race. Those were problems that we have inherited. So we shouldn't feel bad about the fact that the problems exist because we didn't cause them. We shouldn't feel guilty about that. We shouldn't feel ashamed about that. But now that we know that these problems exist, the question is, what are we going to do about it? The definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And I feel that that's the place that we're at right now. We're doing things that we've done, in the past, and we see that they're not as effective for what America looks like now and what America will look like in the future. What Minnesota looks like now and what Minnesota will look like in the future. So that's the main thing. Just being open to change. It's not easy, but it's necessary.
So Brookings Institute has been coming out with some real fascinating things, and because of my role I get to sit at lots of different tables, and one of them is looking at regional economic development. And I was sitting with these folks who are mostly from government, and they're telling me that, and Brookings Institute is saying by 2030 over half of our workforce will be from communities of color, that the wage disparities will be greater, that we're not prepared to fill the skills gap that will be left by the baby boomers retiring, but also that America's place in a global economy is changing. Previously, the American middle class drove 50% of the world's demand of consumer goods. And by 2030, that will shrink to 20% because we are no longer having as robust of a middle class anymore. What that means for me, looking at it as a policymaker from the balcony level, is that our global clout will go down. And a lot of the ways that globally we've been able to take care of the United States' interest is to use our economic might and trade sanctions. The world in the next 20 years is going to change vastly for everyone. And the sad part for me is policymakers have, like you said, they've known this. They've known this and done nothing. Nothing to move, and it's almost like it's, they think, there's too big ships and they move too slowly. And the time is coming where some of these things are going to be very costly to figure out. So I'm actually advocating for some haste and making sure that we are looking at income disparities and the educational disparities that lead to that, that we look at what kind of economic development activities we want to do as a society. I guess what I'm advocating is that we be better citizens, and we demand better out of our leaders and our institutions, and that we inform ourselves with multiple news sources, and academic papers and all of those things that demand some leadership that starts to address these changes, but we silo ourselves instead. This is higher ed, and we shouldn't be leaders and advocates about what's happening in K-12 and the terrible attainment that's happening there. Native kids just now eked over 50% of in graduation rates in Minnesota. We have 15 times the incarceration rate. The out-of-home placement rate, opioid-dependent babies, and so, what I'm dealing with as a political leader of a tribe is, well, you people have those casinos, aren't you all better yet? So I'm struggling with the 300 years of kind of, oppression that's kind of internalized itself, and I'm trying to break into some of these venues and say, we need your help to make this better. But it always devolves down to power and money. There are people who feel that, and they have more power, whose interests are motivated largely by money, whose goals and objectives for themselves are always more important than the people on the other side of the table. We harm our environment. Why do we do it? Because that's economic development. People need jobs, right? Where's the balance in our policy making anymore where everybody isn't just a winner and loser, but that we look at inclusion. We look at how to smooth out those bumps and all of those social indicators. So I just had to go on a little bit of a rant here because one of the biggest things that I find vexing in this role is that we are only having conversations singularly in the silo. And I'm going to challenge all of you in higher ed that your role is actually bigger than that. You have to be the voice that says what will change the people coming through your doors. Who says you can't have a role in saying what's going on with K-12? Who says you can't build new advocates who can tell that story for you on the street? Why aren't you talking about what happens when your learners leave here and the fact that they may not be able to find employment in their field or that they're underemployed and that their debt is causing them to not have stable housing circumstances and on and on and on and on. So I think we need to quit saying that, this is what we need within our silo and start being more holistic about what makes us as community members, what is wellness, what is success. And nobody ever felt like they were just okay because they had a piece of paper from one of your institutions. That wasn't a defining moment in their job or in their life. It was that they were happy and self-determined, but we're missing big pieces and big opportunities to be advocates by not being good citizens.
Speaking, I'm going to jump in on an issue that I thought quite a bit about preparing for this. And I have some other questions that I sent to panelists, but I want to make sure that there's time for many questions from the audience. But I think this issue around democracy and participation is shifting some, at least on the ground, right? And so we've had these very public recent events, and we're seeing college students being involved in protest. The Black Lives Matter, the fraternity situation. There's been students on campuses that have protested against graduation speakers, and there's all these things that are happening, and I'm really curious about what is that teaching us, particularly around engagement within the institutions, and are they aligned? Are they miles apart from each other? Are the students seeking something that's not being offered? And what might we think about related to what's happening and social media and all the things that are keeping folks engaged? So you want to start? I'm going to start. Well, go ahead, Nikki.
So I'm obviously up close and personal with these issues for Black Lives Matter. So I've been an advisor and a spokesperson on behalf of Black Lives Matter. And I'm one of the 11 people who was charged by the Bloomington City Attorney for participating in the December 20th.
How many charges do you have?
I have eight pending charges. I always joke about making it out of the inner city with no criminal history and then fighting for justice, and then suddenly, I'm dealing with these issues. But one of the beautiful aspects of all this is the fact that I have a great deal of institutional support behind me. As a matter of fact, my dean took to Twitter to say, you want to know why we're not troubled that one of our professors stands accused of breaking the law. And then there was a link to Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. That was very powerful for me as a faculty member to have institutional support for engaging in advocacy, engaging in civil disobedience, and trying to lead by example in terms of thinking about how to put the education that I have received to good use for the general public and for those who are being marginalized and oppressed and whose voices are not being heard. That's what I feel is my role as a professor, to be able to teach, to lead by example, and to encourage students to use the gifts and the talents and the skills that they have to advance the cause of justice in our society. What's happening now with Black Lives Matter, I think can inform institutions in terms of the fact that what happens outside of the ivory tower, the walls of the institution, will ultimately have an impact on what happens inside of the institution. How many of these stories have we heard? Even Mike Brown, he was about to start college before he was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And then what about the young man in Virginia who wound up being beaten to a pulp because of an incident in a bar? And this was, people say, this was an honor student. And so young people are not insulated from what is happening outside the walls of the institution. We need to acknowledge that and to make sure that we're paying attention, that we're not just seeing those things as something happening out there, but we're being reflective about how does this impact who we are as people inside of an institution and our role in terms of bridging the gap between our students and the broader community. So I think those are some of the questions that need to be asked. And then I also think that when you look back at the 60s, a lot of the social movement that was happening was driven by students. College students, many of them from middle class backgrounds who got on buses and traveled to Mississippi to try to register people to vote. They put their lives on the line. And so I think the students are searching for more. They're looking for ways to take the education that they're receiving and to apply it in a broader social context. So I think that we need to create avenues for them to be able to do that as effectively as possible and not penalize or discourage them. We need to give them wisdom. We need to make sure they understand what's happened historically so that they have a roadmap. But we need to be encouraging them to be catalysts for change and bridge builders.
For me, one of the things that Black Lives Matter drove home, or has driven home, is constantly driving home to me about where we sit as colleges and universities is the reality that the language of diversity is entirely inadequate to the situation we face. So to me, diversity is a kind of friendly way of talking about the fact that we come from different cultures, backgrounds, etc., all true. But it covers up inequality, it covers up injustice, it covers up the fact that people from different communities are living in quite different realities, and that unfortunately, and for me this is also connected to what is fortunately finally a real discussion about sexual assault on campuses, the fact that we still have in our society and reflected on our campuses hierarchies that are maintained through violence. And that is fundamentally antithetical to any claim to being an effective democracy, and it's something, from my perspective, we need our institutions to speak honestly about, and we need to prepare our students to confront directly. And I guess the last thing I would say is there's mounting evidence that the impact of all the good work we do with students, service, learning, engagement, etc., that the extent to which it's effective is mediated by the extent to which the students involved think the universities where they are actually committed to these values. So students are not fooled by this. If the colleges and universities they're in aren't actually lining up in support of democracy and equality and the fight against oppression, they notice this, and the impact of our work is diminished. So for me, if we're going to do this work and be taken seriously doing it, we have to frame it in an honest way that reflects the realities of our society that, again, certainly show up on our campuses.
We're also very excited and honored to have with us today Andrew Seligson, who is the president of the National Campus Compact. Though he lives in Boston, Andrew has a real fondness for Minnesota, having spent 10 years here, earning a political science PhD at the university and teaching at St. Olaf College. We'd welcome him here even if that weren't the case, but we're particularly glad to have you back. Andrew has been traveling around the country since he started his position at the Compact 9 months ago, and as you'll hear, he shares our commitment both to celebrating the good civic work already happening and building on it strategically to accelerate change within our campuses and our communities and our state. Please join me in welcoming National Campus Compact President Andrew Sellerson.
Thank you very much. It is true that I am thrilled to be back in Minnesota. And I was just going to spend my 5 minutes or so up here just mentioning all the places I really love here. Like, oh, I used to live in Powder Mountain Park. I love Powder Mountain Park. But that might be a little boring for you, but it is never boring for me. So I do have associations with some fine Minnesota institutions, the University of Minnesota. I also taught at St. Olaf. I also taught at McAllister, so I just want to make sure that the gets out there. And if there's anybody in the audience who I ever gave a bad grade to, I apologize for that. I'm sure it was my mistake. So it is really terrific to be here for many reasons. Campus Compact was indeed founded nearly 30 years ago. Next year we will be celebrating our 30th anniversary, so I'm going to ask you all to mark your calendars. March 21 to 23 in Boston, we will be having a national conference to celebrate the work that we've been doing for 30 years, but also to challenge ourselves to accelerate the pace of change in higher education and the work we're doing to engage communities, and I hope you all will be there. As part of our preparations for that conference, I have been kind of digging deep into the history of Campus Compact. And I am really a political theorist, kind of intellectual historian, so this is work that I feel pretty well prepared for. And one of the things that's been really striking to me is that in the early documents surrounding the founding of the Compact, the college and university presidents and other leaders who came together to make this commitment to each other represented by the Compact, the early language is all about a deep concern with the future of democracy in the United States. A sense in the mid-1980s that we were collectively losing our capacity to think and speak and act together with a focus on the common good and ways that we could envision the community all of us want to live in together. And so these higher education leaders thought that colleges and universities both were unintentionally in some ways embroiled in that problem and also had a role to play in trying to solve it. And so they began to proliferate some, what I think of as extended experiments to answer the question of whether engaging students and faculty and staff and institutions more deeply in the work of their communities, in public work to make positive change in their communities, whether that might not be part of the solution to the democratic challenge that they saw around them. And I think the evidence is that goes a pretty good part of the way, and it doesn't go all the way. So I think we have found that the work we've been doing has had a tremendously positive impact on students, a tremendously positive impact on communities, that we have indeed seen significant change in our institutions. And now Campus Compact nationally has about 1,100 members. We are a significant force. To some extent, this work is now expected as part of our colleges and universities. But I think it's also the case, a couple things. One, none of us probably thinks that the challenge that was identified in the 1980s has been solved, that we now are so effective at practicing democracy that we are effectively confronting the real challenges facing us. I don't think any of us would say that. So we still have a huge challenge ahead of us, and it's only compounded by the explosion of inequality that we have seen in our country over the ensuing 30 years since Campus Compact was founded. And that makes it much more difficult, right? To achieve a meaningful and effective democracy in the context of deeply embedded inequality is probably not a nut you can crack. And so we have to take on the challenge of inequality as well. So that, for me, is the work that's ahead of us, is deepening our efforts, making them more effective, reconnecting them in some ways to the democratic spirit that was the impulse behind the founding of Campus Compact. And I don't only say this because I think Julie Plout is fantastic and because you have such great presidential leadership. your board chair and your board, and because I just love Minnesota. But I really do think the work that's going on here in Minnesota is exemplary of the kind of work we need to be doing nationally. Engaging in deep partnerships that really do ask fundamental questions about our colleges and universities and how we need to change to achieve the goals that we share. That work is happening here, and we need to see more and more of it everywhere. So I think Minnesota, as in so many other things, is out front and is providing a great example. And you know, I view this not really as an organization, Campus Compact, but as a movement and as a participant in a larger movement for the democratic purposes of higher education. And so I would ask all of you who are doing this terrific work on your campuses, work that we will celebrate, and doing this great work in your communities, that you join us and you help us provide these great examples. Share the things you know, share the challenges you face, and help all of us nationally get better and better at doing this work. Again, our conference next year is one opportunity to do that, but one of the sort of pieces of our work at National Campus Compact is finding more and more ways that we can, as a network, learn more from each other and become more and more effective at doing this work. So again, I want to thank you all for being here, for doing the work that we're celebrating today, for joining together to learn from each other and share. And I hope that you also will see yourselves as part of this national movement to remake the landscape of higher education to reflect the values of equality and democracy that motivated the founding of Campus Compact in the first place. Thank you very much.